Good afternoon. My name is George Lemieux. I have the privilege of being the chairman of the board of the Gunsther law firm, and I'm pleased to provide to you today and present to you today our COVID-19 webinar on how to protect your business against fraud and other internal and external threats. Today's webinar is co-hosted by Gunsther law firm as well as KPMG Miami. Few housekeeping things for us to discuss before we get started. We are recording this webinar. You can view a replay on demand from Gunsther's COVID-19 website. It will be available by tomorrow morning. Feel free to share it with others. You can find additional information and resources there as well. Go to Gunsther/COVID-19, no hyphen, just COVID-19 altogether. I encourage you to submit questions you have using the Q&A feature on your screen. The questions will be sorted, read aloud anonymously, and answered by the most appropriate person who's presenting today. You can start presenting those and providing those questions right now. We've also created a dedicated COVID-19 email box at the Gunsther law firm. So if you have a question that comes up later after the webinar, you can email us at covid19@gunsther.com. That's covid19@gunsther.com. The COVID-19 outbreak has surfaced new internal and external threats that businesses need to be able to detect and predict in order to protect every corner of their organization. External cybersecurity issues are on the rise. Cyber attacks have increased along with rapid worldwide spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. As of March 30th, the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, also known as IC3, had received more than 1,200 complaints related to COVID-19 scams, and Florida federal and state authorities have launched COVID-19 fraud task forces. Our speakers today have a lot of experience combating these types of fraud. We are very privileged to have 4 panelists to address not only the internal threats that are presented, but also the external threats. Let me introduce them to you now. Nathan Hale is a Gunsther shareholder in our Orlando office. He specializes in business litigation, white-collar criminal defense, and internal investigations. And he's a former assistant United States attorney in the Middle District of Florida. Jim Arnold is a principal at KPMG's Cybersecurity Group. And he helps to lead KPMG's cyber response practice and their national insurance sector. Jim has over 20 years of private practice, in-house legal, cyber, and forensic consulting experience in industries including manufacturing, financial services, power and utilities, real estate management, and consumer products. Jonathan Osborne is a shareholder at Gunsther in our Fort Lauderdale office. He does work in business litigation, white-collar criminal defense, and internal investigations. Jonathan's also a former assistant United States attorney. He was an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Florida. While he was an AUSA, he investigated and prosecuted a wide array of criminal violations by companies and individuals, including allegations of fraud, computer crimes, and identity theft. Our fourth presenter today is Ivan Velez Leone. Ivan is the managing director in the Miami office of KPMG's Forensic Advisory Service Practice. He's a certified public accountant, certified fraud examiner. Ivan has over 20 years of business advisory experience in multinational Big Four professional service firms. His practice encompasses assignments in the commercial, retail, financial services, industrial, and government environments. He assists organization attorneys in the U.S. and Latin America in the areas of fraud, white-collar crime, bribery and corruption investigations, dispute advisory, business valuation, financial modeling, and cost reduction strategies. We're going to start today's presentation on the external threats, and Nathan Hale and Jim Arnold are going to answer questions. We're going to have a discussion with them, and then we'll move to the internal questions, or the internal threats rather, in a few minutes. So Nate and Jim, there's been an exponential rise in the number of social engineering campaigns and malicious emails. News reports recently that the Chinese government may in fact have been behind some of these malicious misinformation campaigns. So why don't we start with you, Nate? Question for you. What are quote unquote external threats, and how does the current crisis affect vulnerabilities to them?
Thank you, George, and welcome everybody. So external threats can encompass all sorts of fraud and scams. But I think from the perspective of a business trying to defend against these things, we can group them into two general categories. And the first is the exploitation of system or software vulnerabilities. So hacking, effectively computer hacking. And then the second group is, I think, what I could refer to as exploiting employee vulnerabilities. And the most common of those is these malicious email, business email compromise scams. In those scams, significantly, I think, for our purposes today, it doesn't necessarily matter how good of a cyber defense your company might have. If an employee clicks on a link or responds to a request for login information, right there, your system is accessible, regardless of any firewalls or other encryption that you might have in your system. Jim can talk a little bit more about the software section, I think. But before we do that, I just wanted to define exactly what I mean by email compromise scams. Law enforcement knows them as BEC, business email scams. And really the point is to commandeer the email account of an employee at your business, and then impersonate the holder of that account to send emails to colleagues, assistants, vendors, somebody else, and to convince them to send a wire to the fraudster's bank account. And those are a particular concern now, given the fact that a lot more of us are working from home and relying on email as opposed to other forms of communication.
Yeah, we've all gotten those emails and seen those emails in our companies where someone impersonates, a senior level manager, sending a instruction to try to do something. How do our employees, how can they tell whether or not that is a fraudulent or a phishing email?
Well, that's a complicated question, in part because I think in recent years, fraudsters have gotten much more sophisticated, and the public perception of these emails hasn't kept pace. So I think we tend to think of fraudulent emails as coming from foreign countries with misspelled words, broken English that are easy to detect, and that's just not the case anymore. Nowadays, fraudsters will obtain access to an email account and monitor communications for weeks in some cases. And they'll learn the way that the email account user responds to people, the way that they sign their emails, and they'll learn their routines. I think a good example is a couple months back, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal that the chairman and CEO of Dash Brands, which is the company that owns Domino's Pizza, lost $450,000 in one of these scams, because the fraudster learned that he was going to be traveling to China for work. And so 3 hours after his plane supposedly landed, when he fell asleep, hackers sent an email to his assistant asking her to wire $150,000 to China. And because he was in China at the time, it didn't seem unusual. And the hackers also took the step of changing the email rules for his email account. So all of the communications were deleted. So he didn't realize that had happened until days later when he went back, when he got back to the United States. And the assistant mentioned that the email actually was exactly like he would say, exactly like he would word an email, and it included an attachment with transfer instructions that showed intimate knowledge of his accounts. So the best thing you can do, I think, for these types of fraudulent emails is to authenticate, to double check by a phone call. And that is by far the best way to prevent these things. But the criminals know that, and so they try to time their emails in situations where it's urgent to send that wire, or where, like in the Dash Brands case, the CEO was in China and asleep at the time. So it's important to drum into employees the idea that anytime you send money, you may not be able to tell if the email is fraudulent or not, but you got to double check through a phone call.
So having procedures in place to protect against those sort of snap judgments that can come, or sort of false pretenses. Well, I know that person's asleep now, so I'm not going to bother them. But having those procedures in place can really help companies prevent, the architecture that the fraudsters have set up.
Yeah, that is correct. And it comes down to more than just having strong firewalls, because you can be a victim of a fraud scheme like this, even if your internal system isn't hacked. I had a client very recently who had a vendor whose account was hacked. And they sent an email and convinced them to wire money to the wrong place. And in that situation, even their cyber insurance policy wouldn't cover the loss because their internal system wasn't hacked.
Yeah, we really all need to become better educated on preventing these things from happening and understand what the fraudsters are trying to do. And like you said, they're not just misspelled emails anymore. They've become very sophisticated. What happens and what do you do, Nate, if you've been hacked, you've fallen victim to one of these fraud schemes? What's the next steps that you should take?
So we have checklists that we provided it to clients before and that the FBI circulates with a list of things to do. And the first thing I would say is that you should have this internal list that employees have, because even if you send a wire to a wrong place, there is a good chance you can get that wire frozen or recalled if you contact the bank soon enough. So the first thing to do is to contact your bank. Call them immediately and speak to somebody who has the authority to recall a wire. That's the first most important thing that you should do. After that, you can report the incident to the FBI, and you do that through the IC3 website, and that's the FBI's computer crime fraud branch, and the website is ic3.gov. And those are the two most important things that you can do.
Thank you, Nate. That's really helpful. I want to turn things over to James for a little bit. James, we're in this extraordinary time with the pandemic virus. We had a lot of people, most companies did, who could work remotely. Accounting firms have been the leaders in this for many years. But now we're in a situation where nearly everyone is working remotely. So with that rush to work remotely and with virtual environments being particularly vulnerable, what precautions can businesses take to shore up their systems to protect from these external threats?
Hey, George, thanks for that question. And thanks, everyone, for joining. And I hope you all appreciate I got dressed up today by putting on my KPMG hat because I've been in lockdown for about 6 weeks. I'm starting to look like Santa Claus. But, you bring up some good points. And, overall, we're not making any suggestions around cybersecurity that we never made before. But as you mentioned, now that everybody's working remotely, the attackers are able to exploit much more than they were before. We have a lot of organizations that are doing things differently now than they never did before. And I'll just give you an example. I was working with a client 2 weeks ago, actually, with a business email compromise, very similar to what Nate just described. And we were on the call with the general counsel and their IT guy. And when I say IT guy, I mean the IT guy. And explain to him what we need him to do from a security perspective. And, there were a list of 4 or 5 things, enable multi-factor authentication, make sure he's patching the systems. And his name was Steve, and Steve listened very intently. And he said, well, Jim, let me tell you, it's going to be about 3 weeks before I get to any of those things, because now I have 750 employees working remotely. All I do all day is answer help desk calls and help them to, address their issues. And I very politely, reminded him and the general counsel that that's exactly why they're in the situation they're in, and they need to focus a little bit more on their overall cybersecurity program, because, again, we're all in a new environment here, and every weakness that might not have been an issue before is now being exploited because we all were working remotely. You might see things coming through your firewall that you never saw before. You relax the firewall rules a little bit to allow for more access for your employees, but that means you're allowing more access for the bad guys also. And I can tell you that, in this lockdown period, our cyber response team, while we never slow down, we've never been any busier than we are now. I mean, we're going gangbusters globally with website exploits, business email compromises, ransomware. It's all of those things. So it's just really need to focus on the basic things. And, I have a laundry list of things we can go through. When you think about from, a perspective of working remotely now, have you implemented multi-factor authentication across your email and your O365? It's very simple to do. It's free. It's part of the program with O365. So, it takes a little bit of time and people don't like it because they have to do a two-step process, but, we need to be more secure. So simple things like doing that. Do you actually have any type of EDR, endpoint detection systems working, from a monitoring perspective? And are you looking at those? I mean, many of the compromises our team works on, our clients have the latest technology, and they actually are logging and capturing what all the bad guys are doing, but nobody's looking at it or acting on it until it's too late. So if you do have those tools, make sure you know how to use them, and you look at those regularly. Other thing, most importantly right now, is just the overall employee education. Nate touched on it a little bit, but overall employee education, do they understand, what they're supposed to do, not plug in from a public Wi-Fi location, are they VPN into the system properly? Are they using the right devices? Are they properly encrypting data before they email it to their Gmail account? Not that you should do that anyway, but, are they doing those things that just are common sense? And I'll pause there and see, what next question I might be able to add to.
Well, I think that's very helpful, Jim. And, implementing these things like the multi-factor authentication is something that can be done right away for businesses if they're not doing it. What we ask people like you to do for us is to look around corners and see what's coming next. We know these fraudsters are really sophisticated. What should we be looking for? They got to know that, like you said, you've just been busy responding to all of these requests from your clients. The fraudsters know that we're in a fragile situation right now. What should we be looking for? What are you thinking? Where are they going? What should we be thinking about in terms of what else we can do as they get more and more sophisticated?
We're asking all of our clients, and, unfortunately for me, I make money when bad things happen to people. I'd like to make money by helping people prevent bad things from happening. So really looking at your overall cybersecurity program, right? Do you have the policies and procedures in place? Do you, and I've touched on it again, but educating employees is critical, right? Because 50% of attacks come from employees, whether it's intentional internal threat, like we'll talk about later, or just unintentional because they do click on that website, or they don't realize an issue's here or there, or they lose a device and don't have it encrypted and those things. So overall, you just need to go back and look at your overall cybersecurity program. Have you educated your employees? Do you have the right data loss prevention tools in place? Do you have a good endpoint detection tool in place? Do you have ways for your employees to escalate when they get one of those strange emails? Like I was recently at Microsoft's data center out in Seattle about 6 months ago, actually. And we were presented with how they go about, their phishing education, right? Some places like KPMG, we do a lot of the phishing education schemes where they send us those emails like, hey, here's your free Starbucks coffee. I'm happy to say I've never been caught up in one of those because I don't even answer the KPMG emails I'm supposed to answer, but because I get too many. But what I was interesting when I heard from the Microsoft folks, they said, like at KPMG, if you click on one of those emails improperly, they'll send you an email, and then you got to do some additional training. What the Microsoft folks have learned overall is when you send one of those emails and Jim Arnold catches it and sends it to the right spot, they give them a $10 Starbucks card or something, right? So it's more of a incentive to help people understand why it's important for them to do things. But, just to sum up, I think overall you just got to be more on your toes now because there's new things in your environment and a lot more activity than we're used to. So I think, overall, just look at your overall cybersecurity program and just do the basic things you were trying to do before, or should have been doing before.
Jim, that's really great advice. Thank you. I know here at Gunsther, our IT department sends out those kind of, internal phishing emails to see who bites, right? It's part of the training program. So I think that's something else that can be happening now. I know IT departments are stressed and strained with trying to keep up with everybody working remotely, but this is probably the best time to be running those kind of tests. I want to turn to internal threats. Jonathan, Osborne, and Ivan, Velez, Leone, let's talk about what we need to be looking for from internal threats and in this time of heightened concerns about fraud. The CARES Act we've all been learning about. It's provided $2.2 trillion in its first tranche of relief, $349 billion in loans eligible to small businesses, those businesses with 500 employees or less. That fund was exhausted, and Congress came back now and has put an additional $320 billion into a second round of funding for the Paycheck Protection Program. We expect the president to sign that really at any moment in order to get that into law and to provide more dollars for small businesses to apply for. Remember, they're loans, but they're potentially forgivable loans if the requirements are met to spend that on at least 75% of it on payroll and other authorized expenses. So that's a lot of money coming from the federal government. We all remember the 2008, 2009 financial recession we had in this country, the Great Recession it was called. And we remember that there was a lot of federal funding programs like TARP and bailouts of financial institutions that later turned into criminal investigations, civil investigations by the Department of Justice. Lots of fines were paid by organizations. And there's no reason to think that that won't happen again with all of this money flowing from Washington, from the Small Business Administration, also flowing from our state governments in terms of bridge loans and things like that. So, Jonathan, let me turn it to you. What is the federal government's role in oversight of the PPP program?
Thank you, George, and good afternoon, everyone. In a word, the government's role is huge. And to use an example from Game of Thrones, we can rest assured that the investigations are coming, the subpoenas are coming, and the oversight is coming. We already have examples from this week. For example, just yesterday, Senator Rubio in Florida issued 12 letters to the largest banks in the country. And the focus of the letters is to provide oversight and inquiries as to what processes the banks followed in receiving the PPP loans just a few weeks ago. The Treasury Department, in addition to Congress, as well as the Department of Justice, will also have a critical role in oversight, not only of the application process and the bank side of the lending, but also as it relates to the companies that received the funds during the first round and the future rounds of PPP funding. In response to that scrutiny from the Treasury Department, we've already seen that large companies, including Ruth's Chris and Shake Shack and other public companies, have already taken a look at their applications and decided that they are actually going to return the funds that they've already received under the first round of funding under the CARES Act. And I want to talk just for a moment about the CARES Act and how it actually creates opportunities for government oversight. Anyone who considered applying for a loan or who actually submitted a PPP application knows that the application process required them and their business to make certain self-certifications before receiving funds. One of those self-certifications was that the business was in operation in February of 2020. Another certification was that the business had less than 500 employees or was subject to a different exception to the rule on the number of employees. But the critical certification for today's purposes is that which required the businesses to make a statement that economic uncertainty made the loan, quote, necessary to support their ongoing operations. And the self-certification aspect of the application also required each business to state that they understood that all of the representations made in the application were subject to punishment under the law if they were later deemed to be false. Thus, every business that applied for a PPP loan made themselves a potential target of a fraud investigation, either at the congressional level or at the law enforcement level. And the common statutes at the law enforcement level that will be applicable would include the False Claims Act, as well as Title 18 USC 1001, which simply makes it a federal crime to make any false statement to the federal government. There are also other regulations, including the wire fraud statute, which are very broad in their application. And so to summarize, we anticipate that where so much funding was distributed to businesses throughout the country, both large and public, as well as small, that the congressional committees, including the committee on which Senator Rubio serves, as well as the Judiciary Committee, as well as the law enforcement arms of the Treasury Department and the DOJ, will continue what has already started as a very vigorous and a very comprehensive review of funding.
Jonathan, you mentioned the Department of Justice. What agencies will be investigating allegations of fraud under the CARES Act? Will it be DOJ?
Yes, so it'll be the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department's Inspector General, and Congress has also empowered the Government Accountability Office to have wide-ranging authority to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse as it relates to really any type of fraud arising during the pandemic.
So what do you do, Jonathan, if you get a knock on the door from the federal government? Is it going to be, would you suspect it's a phone call? Is it a subpoena? How will DOJ or the Government Accountability Office, how will they approach businesses if they're investigating, what they think is PPP fraud?
I think there's going to be at least 3 methods of contact. One could be an inquiry or a letter or an audit. And so that would be an example of what Senator Rubio has already started doing at the congressional level. Second, there could be subpoenas. And to answer your question directly, if a subpoena is received, the first thing to do is to review all of the document requests in the subpoena and to discuss them with your counsel. And that could be your in-house counsel or your external counsel. And it is key that you have assistance in complying with the subpoena's demands, but also understanding how the process works.
So Jonathan, if I'm considering applying for this second round of PPP funding, or if I've already applied and at some point, having received the funds, I'm going to seek loan forgiveness, what counsel would you provide for me as a business owner in navigating either the application or the forgiveness request?
Sure. So there are a few key points, and I think it warrants ongoing discussion if a business is in either of those situations. They've either received funds or they intend to apply in the future. But a few key points. The first is that if your business has a lot of employees or received a significant amount of funds, either in the first round or the second round of funding, I think it's safe to operate as if you expect an audit in the future. The primary focus for criminal investigations like those that I used to lead as a prosecutor and that Nathan used to lead as a prosecutor will be on the companies that have committed outright and deliberate fraud. They generally will not want to prosecute companies that made a mistake and who relied on legal counsel in reaching their determinations that they were eligible for this funding. And so it's very important that you work with your counsel so that you not only have a proper basis to seek funding, but so that you also have kept proper and sufficient records so that your response to the audit, your response to the subpoena, or your response to any other type of government interaction is comprehensive and it gives your company the least business intrusion. Because ultimately, even if you're not prosecuted, receiving a subpoena or being investigated can be a significant business interruption, particularly where in the wake of a pandemic, you're trying to get your business back on its feet.
Yeah, you bring up some very good points, Jonathan. So that documentation is really important in any investigation, because what you tell to the federal investigator later about what your thoughts were at the time doesn't mean much if it wasn't in writing. So having documents that say, to that certification point that Jonathan made about, we needed this money for the ongoing operations of our firm, having some, contemporaneous justification. Wouldn't you say, Jonathan, that's really important? Or as you mentioned, reaching out to counsel?
Yes, it's key. And I would say that for any business that is seeking funding, either under the PPP program or any related relief program, you should treat the application process, you should treat the receipt of funds and the use of the funds as if you are assuming that an audit is coming in the future. With so many billions of dollars being distributed from the federal government, we are, I think, assured already by the Treasury Department, by Congress, and by the Department of Justice that they are going to be exercising significant oversight over how these funds are used and making sure that they are in the right hands.
Yeah, and 2 additional points on that, and then I want to turn it over to Ivan. And I also want to remind everybody to submit questions. We've gotten some questions in, and this is your time. You've got that Q&A box. Put the questions in. We'll make sure we get to them for the remainder here of our presentation. But one is keeping a separate account for these federal government funds or state government funds you receive. That way it's going to be easy to show, especially for the PPP program, how you spent the money. Because if you're going to seek to have that forgiven, being able to show what you spent it on, the outflows from that account is really important. Second is just be aware that certain businesses are not going to be favored in the public eye for receiving these funds. Jonathan mentioned, Shake Shack and Ruth Chris and others. For example, a real estate development firm or other firm like that, there's going to be more optics, and these are politicians who are going to be involved. And having been one, I can tell you, even though I'm recovered now, that there are going to be targets on the backs of some of these organizations. So you got to be very thoughtful about this and make sure that you're using the money appropriately and exactly as the requirements of the program provide. Let me turn it over to Ivan now, who from KPMG Miami. And Ivan, this is such an extraordinary time for us in these economic downturns. We often see that there's an increase of exposed fraud and increase in the occurrence of fraud. I mean, we'll never forget what happened after the Great Recession when the Madoff scheme was exposed, the Rothstein scheme was exposed. What do we have to be on the lookout for now during this economic downturn in terms of the increase of fraud in our organizations?
Yeah, and thank you, George. So basically, you're absolutely right. I mean, in times of an economic downturn, there usually is an increase. There's an increase in fraud and corruption. I mean, we've certainly seen that throughout the years, right after the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. And I think if you look at the risk factors, they all go back to what we call the fraud pyramid, the fraud triangle. It's a concept by an American criminologist, Donald Christie. He developed basically 3 main factors for the occurrence of fraud. Basically, there has to be an incentive or pressure, an opportunity, and the rationalization that what they're doing is, somehow justified. So I think this model explains precisely what's going to happen in terms of the risks of fraud and for someone to commit occupational fraud in this new environment. So just to give you an example, in terms of pressure or motivation, things that individuals may be looking, somebody that's unethical, that may be thinking about committing fraud, and some of the motivations or pressures will be either debt or plain greed, lifestyle needs, the fear of job loss, especially in this environment, gambling addictions, drug addictions, motivations, pressure to perform, as we, companies are suffering right now, and sales targets are not being met, and there is an increase in the pressure to perform. Therefore, that also leads to increase in fraud and financial reporting irregularities. We certainly saw that in the Great Recession of 2008. We think that's still going to happen. Then the opportunity, which is the factor that companies can control. So in terms of opportunity, if especially in these times when there are personnel reductions. So if you reduce personnel and some of that personnel is in key positions where there needs to be a segregation of duties in order for a control to be operating effectively, and now you consolidated those two roles into one person, then you are basically increasing the risk of fraud. Because at the end of the day, just to give you a example, if you have somebody that is working in accounts payable and somebody it's also approving invoices and approving payments or issuing payments, and you eliminate those positions and consolidate those into one role, then guess what? You've just given somebody else an opportunity to commit fraud. And if all these factors are present, then certainly that will result in increased fraud risk for the organization. I can provide some examples later on in terms of some of the things that we've seen, but generally that's how we like to measure the increase in risk, like the fraud triangle.
I think, Ivan, that's a really good way to think about this, in that, and now the pressures and the reasons for fraud, the incentives for fraud have increased. You've got people in financial distress, so you could have an employee that's, he's getting his compensation reduced. They could be at full compensation, but they could have a spouse who has lost their job. So there's financial pressure that gives an incentive for people to steal. And then to the point you made, which is really important, is having the right controls in place so that there aren't people with all the power to be able to perpetrate the fraud. We've had clients here at Gunsther where, that internal finance person just had way too much authority to be able to make decisions without oversight. And it gives with the increased financial distress and pressure, it gives people more incentives for fraud. And then if the controls aren't in place, they have the opportunity to commit that fraud. So I think you raised some great points. Give us some examples, I think you were headed here, of different types of fraud schemes you've observed. We can all learn anecdotally, I think, from some of the past schemes that you've counseled clients on and through.
Yeah, right after the recession, we saw a lot of activity in terms of potential irregularities that ended up being fraud. So there was an increase actually in the number of cases that were reported in the company's in some of the company's hotline and allegations of fraud. Mainly there are many allegations, but I'm going to focus on two specific ones. Misappropriation of assets. Like, we're not talking just your petty inventory theft. We're talking theft of cash. And because if you find yourself in a situation where your controls are not appropriate, and then you're most vulnerable in order to for somebody to commit fraud, that is one of the key targets, cash. That's essentially a very liquid asset. And the other one is bribery and corruption. I'm going to give you an example of one of each. So we had a client that we conducted an investigation at some undisclosed country in Latin America, where two employees colluded with a third-party distributor to embezzle over $3 million of funds through the use of what is called credit note. So a credit note is, for those of you wondering what that is, it's basically when you sell a product to a customer or to a distributor, and you want to provide a discount or a credit for a damaged product, you issue a credit note. So in this case, there were a number of credit notes that were issued and netted against the account of this particular customer. So they were in collusion with company employees and this third party. So the way that they did it is, in the time of economic downturn, generally you have, and this was an international operation, this was the subsidiary of a U.S. company, and they recorded their transactions in local currency. But when at the time of consolidating financial statements, you need to convert that into U.S. dollars, and you need to convert it at the rate present, effective, and the date of the transaction. So throughout the entire process, companies are recognizing either gains or losses from currency exchange. So in this time, there were significant losses in currency exchange rates. So they took those losses and applied them. And I'm not going to get into technical accounting, but at the end of the day, they were able to apply some of those losses against the customer account to reduce the balance, essentially giving them free product. And we found through email reviews that basically these employees received kickbacks and they enriched themselves. And we suspect, although we didn't find direct evidence, that one of those, some of those payments may have gone to foreign government officials because the distributor won a big contract with the government around the time that this happened. So, that's just to give you an example of one of the things, some of the factors when you don't have the right controls in place, what can happen with employees working from the inside and colluding with third-party vendors. It's just one example. Another one that I wanted to touch on, bribery and corruption. I cannot stress this enough. In these times when there's uncertainty, companies are struggling, not only U.S. government, but foreign governments as well. They tend to get more involved in economic activity. They either implement some stimulus programs, they invest in infrastructure projects to stimulate the economy, and that provides a lot of opportunity for companies that are struggling to participate in these competitive bids and tenders in order to win those contracts. And the manner in which some of what we've seen in the past, right after the recession, some of the things that we saw, just to give you an example, we had a client at another undisclosed country in Latin America. They're in the manufacturing of industrial equipment and supplies. And during the course of the investigation, there were allegations that something had happened, that essentially somebody was bribed. This was a subsidiary of a U.S. company. We found cash withdrawals amounting to $200,000 that were unaccounted for. Yes, they withdrew the cash, and supposedly there was cash on hand, but we asked to count the cash, and it was not there. So as we went along throughout the investigation, we found email communications showing that there were communications between one of the members of senior management, who at the end of the day basically handed over $200,000 US to the principal of the joint venture partner, and they were both bidding for a large infrastructure project, of which $5 million was the portion for the subsidiary of our client. So in the end, they were low in cash, but they considered that this would be a good investment, say $200,000, because at the end of the day, they had very good margins. So they made over $2.5 million on those products that they sold. And they used third parties that they did not, submit to due diligence. They, lack of controls in order to be able to withdraw cash just as easily as that and pay it to a third party. So, at the end of the day, we uncovered that from the investigation. Of course, they took remedial actions and ended up firing these employees. There are many other examples, but of course, we could spend all afternoon talking about some of these examples. They help us everything, including financial reporting fraud and earning management schemes, which are also, we saw a lot of that during the Great Recession, and we expect we're going to see that as well.
Thank you very much, Ivan. So, controls are so important, and knowing your vendors, knowing your employees, and just keeping a watchful eye. I think those are some really good takeaways from your presentation. We've gotten some questions that have come in from the folks that are watching our webinar here today, and I want to toss those to different folks here who are on our panel to answer the questions. We got a question from one of our folks wanting to know what are data protection tools that we need, or I should say data loss protection tools that we need in order to prevent fraud. So I think, Jim, you probably would be a good person to answer that question.
Yeah, George, thanks. I'd be happy to answer that. And, there's no simple answer, right? There's many, many different data loss protection tools. Symantec, Bond2, SolarWinds, Secure Trust, Checkpoint, Digital Guardian. Microsoft actually has rolled out a data loss protection tool too as part of its suite of services. Whatever the tool is, it's more important to put in the procedures around that. Everything goes back to procedures, right? So whatever your organization is doing right now, and I can tell you, KPMG, we have a very robust data loss protection program. I was actually working on a project in the last 3 days where we MSSP was struck in their hosting where they hosted data for over 100 dentist offices were hit. And as one of those engagements, we were dealing directly with the dentist who actually used a Gmail account. And when we were emailing back and forth with the Gmail account, I immediately got a call from our data loss prevention folks at KPMG and had to explain up and down why I would send something to somebody's Gmail account. So, you can get to that level of detail. But more importantly, what I think you should do, and what the organizations are doing more, is going to more than the prevention than the detection, right? If you're detecting it, it's already out the door. So if you can have a better controls in place to prevent that, and that would be endpoint detection tools, understanding what's going on in the environment. And another thing, I just want to add on to Ivan's internal discussion there of internal threats. And what we see now is, not in addition to the fraud, with all the furloughing going on and things like that, and uncertainty in the market, organizations have told employees, hey, Friday's going to be your last day. Clean out your desk. We'll bring you back as soon as the things come together. But you also see employees then plugging in external drives and downloading, client lists and internal marketing plans and pricing sheets and other things like that because they feel like they're entitled. And in addition, taking specific intellectual property. So I'd encourage you all to understand that that's occurring. Make sure you add that type of information to your checklist and actually do some forensic investigation. There are tools out there now. We have a tool at KPMG we use, and it's called KPMG Digital Responder, that can be run in about 5 minutes on an individual's computer and spit out an English reading or plain English report for the HR person to look at that says, hey, Jim Arnold plugged in USB serial number 1234 yesterday, and he downloaded all this information. Please request that information from him before you give him his final severance check or things like that. So it's just something to think about in this time of crisis, that, good people are going to do things that aren't necessarily, they don't even think they're bad. They think it's their information, but it's actually your company information. You don't want that going out the door.
Jim, that's a really good point. And to that point, we got another question that was asking about enterprise risk and how we, even if the company is not subject to strict regulation, how is the company to stay aware and identify and track, manage risk in that area? And I think you were touching on that, but anything else that you can add and answer to that question?
Yeah, just the overall cybersecurity, right? And it's all been we've been beat over the head with cybersecurity for years now, right? And unfortunately, we still see a lot of companies out there who don't take cybersecurity seriously. And I have a simple analogy when I'm trying to help our clients improve their overall cybersecurity. And I just kind of say it this way: if you're a burglar walking down the street, and there's a house with the doors and the windows open, a house and the doors with windows locked, and a house and the doors with windows locked, and the most advanced security alarm system in the world, where are you going to go? You're going to go to that place with the doors and the windows open. And all we try to do is help our clients identify some of those doors and windows and start locking them one at a time. Like, build a roadmap and just start going down that road. We're not saying you should invest every penny of profit to try to be more secure, because even if you do, they're still going to get in if they want to. But you need to start down that road somewhere. And unfortunately, every client that I assist with a ransomware matter or whatever, they're exponentially more secure after the incident, because they finally realize, wow, this is serious stuff. I need to take it. But again, just do it one at a time. You can't solve all the world problems in one day. You're not going to flip a light switch and you're automatically more secure. But you need to do some form of compromise assessment, vulnerability testing, understand where that is, and then start addressing those one at a time as your budget permits.
Thank you so much, Jim. A couple questions have come in that I think Jonathan is best situated to answer. But if you have any more questions, we've got about 10 minutes left in the webinar, and we'd be happy to take those questions. You've got the Q&A box there. Just submit the question, and we'll get it asked to the right person. So, Jonathan, a question about the PPP program and the certification. And the question is, where do you have to be economically in order to make that certification about the need for the money to continue your business? Do you have to be closing your doors? What tests might the federal government use to evaluate in retrospect whether or not you properly certified that you needed the money?
That's a really insightful question. And so the word used in the application is necessary. And ultimately, I can actually answer this question by tying into the answers to the previous question about protection. And so the spirit of the PPP Act and of the loans, and Senator Rubio actually said this in his letter to the banks, is to provide assistance to small businesses throughout the country who are suffering from having to close their doors during the pandemic. And so we haven't been given a specific test that the government is going to follow. But some things to keep in mind are that the government is going to take into account the size of your company, the nature of your business, from where you derive your income during a normal year. And ultimately, when it comes to an investigation, the question is going to be, what documentation do you have to support your good faith interpretation of the law to provide assistance to you and to your business? And so really, from our perspective, what it boils down to is protection. You have to have in place the internal controls that Ivan talked about, and you have to have in place the documentation and the records, and you have to be able to demonstrate when that audit comes, when the inquiry comes, or when you receive a subpoena, that when you certified that your company was in need, that you did so in good faith, and that your request for the money was legitimate. And I think based on what we know from regulators, both the Treasury Department and from Congress, if a business, in particular a small business, can demonstrate that they took those steps, they should be in good shape.
Ivan, I raised the point about having a separate account in order to show these distributions. It also seems to me from an internal threat standpoint that it's probably important to make sure that that money's not commingled. Any thoughts on that? We got a question specifically on that point.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a question that is actually very common because at the end of the day, how do you prove that you use the funds for the intended purposes of the loan? As you know, cash is fungible. So I'm going to give you an example of, because in my day job, I work at KPMG, but I'm also the finance committee chair of a nonprofit organization, and nonprofits with employees under 500 employees, they do qualify, and our nonprofit did qualify. We actually got the funds, and the way that we did it is as follows: is it really necessary to have a separate account? Not necessarily. However, even in line with what Jonathan said, if you want the cleanest records possible, in order to be able to prove to the government that at the end of the day, you use the money for the intended purposes, it's preferable to have cleaner records. So what we did in the nonprofit was we opened a separate account. That's very easy. Like with online banking, you can do that in 5 minutes. So basically the money was deposited there. The payroll account is going to be funded from that account, so that we know for a fact that we can show the trail of the funds from that account directly into that payroll account, and basically keep all the records about payroll tax and other obligations that the nonprofits pay, basically paid out of that account, including the rest of the other expenses that are eligible. So that's the recommendation. Now, if it's impractical to open a separate bank account, what you could do is in the accounting system, open a separate general ledger account, kind of like a reserve. And basically, the funds received from the loan and then recognize the liability. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that what you're accounting for in your books and records is going out of that account, not necessarily a physical separate account, but that you're at least segregating in your books and records the funds in a separate general ledger account. Hope that answered the question.
It does. Ivan, thank you very much. We've got a question about cyber liability insurance, which I'm going to have Jim tackle. Question is, what policy language coverage should we make sure that are part of the policy if one is trying to obtain cyber liability insurance?
George, thanks for that, and thanks for that question. It's a very important question, and we answer it pretty often. And I'll just give you an example. We had a client who was a cardboard box manufacturer a few years ago that was taken over by ransomware, and they were very proud to show us that they had a cyber insurance policy, but their policy didn't cover ransomware, but it did cover PCI credit cards. Well, they had a ransomware incident, and they never took credit cards, so they didn't do a very good job when they worked with their broker to get their policy. So as a company and an organization, you need to understand what your risk is, your cyber risk, no different than any other of your insurance policies, whether it's for, general liability, fire protection, or whatever. You have some idea of what it is you're trying to prevent. So you need to do a cybersecurity risk assessment. What industry are you in? What types of threats do you typically face? Then work with your broker and the insurance carrier to get an appropriate policy to cover your risks. And I can tell you that working in this space specifically for the last 5 years or so, the carriers are coming around and the brokers are coming around to better understand what their clients need and what the companies need. And the companies are doing a much better job of, getting their CISO involved and others, the CIO, not just letting the chief risk officer sign up for a new insurance policy without understanding what it is. But, that's a long-winded question, but you need to understand what risk you're trying to offset with insurance, and then make sure you get the best policy to do that.
Thank you, Jim. Nate, this question is for you. The question is, I understand that the PGA Tour has a very good set of training videos regarding email security for employees. Where can our folks who are watching this webinar find good training materials?
That's a good question. I think the best thing to do is there's third-party vendors out there that will come in and do a cybersecurity audit for your company. They'll look at your cybersecurity both from the software side, and then they will provide training to your employees. I think that's probably the best way to go. You can also find some resources on the IC3 website. And we also have here at Gunsther a few resources that we might be able to provide if you send an email to covid19@gunsther.com. And I just had one comment to add to what Jim had to say regarding the cyber insurance policies. One thing that cyber insurance typically does not cover is if you are the victim of a business email compromise scam, but your internal system wasn't actually hacked. So say a vendor's email was hacked and they tricked somebody in your company to send the wire to the wrong place. Typically, cyber insurance will only cover when your internal system is hacked. So we've been trying, here at Gunsther, we've worked on some contract amendments. If you have standard form contracts and things that might help mitigate that risk that might fall outside of your insurance policy.
Thank you, Nate. We're coming to the end of our time. We're going to try to handle a couple more questions, but I wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and it can be reviewed on demand starting tomorrow. If you go to our Gunsther COVID-19 website, it's www.gunsther.com/COVID-19. In addition, I've gotten some specific questions about how the forgiveness program works for the PPP plan and how the money is spent. And some of these questions are really kind of dependent upon what type of business you are. So I'd ask you, if you'd like to get some specific answers to those specific questions, you can email us at covid19@gunsther.com and we'll try to respond to you. Having said that, we've got time for a couple more questions, and I want to turn it over to Jonathan. We had a question about whether or not there's going to be another stimulus program, or I guess also to what's in the one that the president's going to sign today. So Jonathan, you want to try to tackle that, and then I can also add on to that.
Sure. So with respect to PPP, I've reviewed the latest version of the bill, and my understanding is that it basically will create a larger pot of money, an extended pot of money for businesses that did not get loans the first time. And so one of the certifications that are necessary under the PPP application, and this is true even of the original application, is that a business certifies that they haven't received and won't receive another loan under the PPP program. And so one of the prerequisites for receiving funds under the second round of funding would presumably be that you didn't receive money in the first round. Otherwise, as George just mentioned, the Gunsther website and the COVID page has a lot of detailed information about what is necessary and what should be included in an application. And so for general information, I direct you there. And for more specific information, we are all available via email to follow up with you. And there's also resources available on our website.
Thank you, Jonathan. I want to thank Nathan Hale, Jim Arnold, Jonathan Osborne, and Ivan Velez Leone. I want to thank you all for watching this webinar today. As Jonathan just mentioned, you can get more information at our website, gunsther.com/COVID-19. There's also a specific section on the CARES Act /CARES Act if you'd like to review that as well. It's CARES-Act. And we appreciate you tuning in today. These are challenging times. We're going to get through them. We're grateful to our colleagues at KPMG for participating in this webinar with us today. We wish you good luck, and we're here to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.